Claire Bennett sat cross-legged on the floor of her Greenwich Village apartment, a half-empty bottle of red wine resting precariously beside her. The room was dimly lit, the only light coming from the flickering glow of her television, which played a rerun of some forgettable romantic comedy. Outside, snowflakes drifted lazily past her window, blanketing the city in a soft, white silence. It was Valentine's Day, and New York City was alive with the kind of romantic energy that made Claire's stomach churn. At 28, Claire was no stranger to heartbreak. Her most recent breakup, just 2 months prior, had left her feeling raw and hollow. Mark, her ex, had been the kind of man who promised forever but delivered only disappointment. Now, as the world celebrated love, Claire had decided to spend the day alone, cocooned in her apartment with her wine, her cat, and her self-pity. The snow outside painted a picture-perfect scene, the kind you'd see on a postcard. Couples walked hand in hand, their breath visible in the cold air, their laughter carrying through the streets. Claire watched them from her window, her fingers tracing the rim of her wine glass. She told herself she didn't care, that she was better off alone, but the ache in her chest betrayed her. It was late afternoon when she finally mustered the energy to check her mailbox. Bundled in a thick coat and scarf, she trudged down the stairs of her building, her boots crunching against the snow. The mailbox was small and rusted, its hinges squeaking as she opened it. Inside, among the usual bills and junk mail, was something that made her pause. A Valentine's card. Claire frowned, pulling it out and turning it over in her hands. The card was ornate, its edges lined with intricate gold filigree. The front bore a bleeding heart, surrounded by thorny roses, and the words, "Be mine," were scrawled in elegant, looping script. It looked old-fashioned, almost antique, and there was something unsettling about it. The paper felt heavy, the kind of weight that made her fingers tingle. She opened it, her breath catching as she read the message inside. "You will be mine forever." The words were written in deep crimson ink, the letters slightly smudged, as though the writer had pressed too hard. There was no signature, no return address, just those 5 chilling words. Claire's heart skipped a beat, and she glanced around the empty street, half expecting to see someone watching her. But the street was deserted, the snow falling in silence. Back in her apartment, Claire tossed the card onto her coffee table, trying to shake off the unease that had settled over her. "It's just a prank," she muttered to herself, pouring another glass of wine. Some idiot trying to be funny. But as the hours passed, she couldn't stop thinking about it. The card felt wrong, like it didn't belong in her world. Its presence was intrusive, almost menacing. That night, as she lay in bed, the apartment seemed quieter than usual. The hum of the radiator, the distant sound of traffic, everything felt muffled, as though the snow had swallowed the city whole. Claire closed her eyes, willing herself to sleep, but just as she began to drift off, she heard it. A whisper. It was faint, barely audible, but it was there. A voice, soft and cold, like the brush of winter wind against her ear. Claire sat bolt upright, her heart pounding. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. But there was no response, only silence. She told herself it was her imagination, the wine playing tricks on her. But as she lay back down, the whisper came again, clearer this time. "Forever." Claire's blood ran cold. She pulled the blankets tighter around her, her eyes darting around the dark room. The card was still on the coffee table, its presence looming like a shadow. She wanted to throw it away, to burn it, but something stopped her. A part of her was afraid of what might happen if she did. Sleep didn't come easily that night. And when it finally did, Claire dreamed of roses, their thorns curling around her wrists, and a voice that whispered promises she didn't want to keep. The next morning, Claire woke to the sound of her cat, Miso, hissing at something in the corner of the room. She groaned, rubbing her eyes as she sat up, her head throbbing from the wine. The apartment was cold, far colder than it should have been, and she could see her breath in the air. Miso's fur was bristled, his tail puffed up like a bottle brush as he stared at the empty corner near the fireplace. "What's wrong with you?" Claire muttered, swinging her legs over the side of the bed. She reached for her robe, shivering as her feet touched the icy floor. Miso didn't respond, his eyes fixed on the corner, his low growl sending a chill down her spine. Claire padded into the living room, her gaze immediately falling on the Valentine's card. It was still on the coffee table where she'd left it, but something about it felt different. The bleeding heart on the front seemed darker, the crimson ink almost glistening, as though it were fresh. She picked it up, her fingers trembling, and opened it again. The message was the same, "You will be mine forever." But now, the word "forever" was underlined, a thick, jagged line that looked like it had been drawn in blood. Claire dropped the card as if it had burned her, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She stared at it, half expecting it to move, to do something, but it just lay there, innocuous and yet utterly wrong. "Get a grip, Claire," she whispered to herself, running a hand through her tangled hair. "It's just a stupid card. Someone's messing with you." But deep down, she didn't believe it. The day passed in a blur. Claire tried to distract herself with work, sketching designs for a new client, but her mind kept wandering back to the card. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the window made her jump. By late afternoon, she couldn't take it anymore. She grabbed her phone and called Sarah, her best friend since college. "Hey, Claire," Sarah answered, her voice cheerful. "What's up? You sound weird." "I am weird," Claire said, pacing the length of her living room. "Something's going on, Sarah. I don't know how to explain it, but I think I'm losing my mind." "Okay, slow down," Sarah said, her tone shifting to concern. "What happened?" Claire told her about the card, about the whispers in the night, about the way the word "forever" had been underlined in what looked like blood. She left out the part about Miso hissing at nothing, that felt too crazy, even for Sarah. "Claire," Sarah said when she finished, "it's probably just some creep playing a prank. You know how people get around Valentine's Day. Someone probably thought it'd be funny to mess with you. But how did they even know I'd be alone?" Claire asked, her voice rising. "And why me? I didn't tell anyone I was staying in." "I don't know," Sarah admitted. "But it's not a curse, okay? Curses aren't real. You're just stressed. Breakups suck, and being alone on Valentine's Day sucks even more. Maybe you're just imagining things." Claire wanted to believe her. She really did. But as the sun set and the apartment grew darker, the unease only deepened. She tried to distract herself with a movie, but halfway through, the chair across from her slid across the floor with a loud screech. Claire froze, her heart pounding as she stared at the chair. It was as if an invisible hand had pushed it. "Okay," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Okay, this isn't happening." She grabbed the card, determined to throw it away, but as she walked toward the trash can, the lights flickered. Claire stopped, her breath catching in her throat. The air around her felt heavy, oppressive, and she could hear it again, the whisper, faint but unmistakable. "Mine." She dropped the card and backed away, her back hitting the wall. The lights flickered again, and this time, they stayed off, plunging the apartment into darkness. Claire fumbled for her phone, using its flashlight to navigate the room. The card lay on the floor, its edges glowing faintly in the dim light. She couldn't bring herself to touch it again. That night, Claire slept with the lights on, Miso curled up at her feet. She told herself it was just her imagination, that Sarah was right, she was stressed, and her mind was playing tricks on her. But as she drifted off to sleep, she heard it again, the whisper, soft and cold, like a breath against her ear. "Forever." And when she woke the next morning, the card was on her pillow, the word "forever" now dripping with fresh blood. Claire stared at the card on her pillow, her stomach churning. The blood, if it was blood, was still wet, glistening in the pale morning light that filtered through her curtains. She recoiled, scrambling out of bed and backing away until her legs hit the wall. Miso, perched on the windowsill, let out a low growl, his eyes fixed on the card as if it were a predator. "This isn't real," Claire whispered, her voice trembling. "This can't be real." But it was. The card was there, the blood was there, and the whispers, those damn whispers, were still echoing in her mind. She couldn't ignore it anymore. Whatever was happening, it wasn't just in her head. She needed answers. After showering and dressing, Claire carefully placed the card in a plastic bag, using a pair of kitchen tongs to avoid touching it directly. She didn't know what she was dealing with, but she wasn't taking any chances. With the bag tucked into her purse, she grabbed her coat and headed out into the cold. The New York Public Library was a short subway ride away, its grand facade a stark contrast to the chaos swirling in Claire's mind. She walked through the towering doors, her boots clicking against the marble floor, and made her way to the research desk. A librarian, an older woman with glasses perched on the end of her nose, looked up as Claire approached. "Can I help you?" the librarian asked, her tone polite but distracted. "I'm looking for information on an old Valentine's card," Claire said, her voice low. "It's antique, I think. Maybe from the 1940s. It has a bleeding heart and roses on the front." The librarian raised an eyebrow but didn't question her. "We have archives of newspapers and periodicals from that era. Let me show you where to start." Claire followed her to a row of microfilm machines, her hands shaking as she loaded the first reel. She started with 1945, the year that had inexplicably popped into her mind. She didn't know why, but something told her that was the right place to look. Hours passed as she scrolled through grainy images of old newspapers, her eyes straining in the dim light. She was about to give up when she saw it, a small article tucked away in the corner of a page. The headline made her blood run cold. "Reclusive artist kills lover, then himself on Valentine's Day." Claire leaned closer, her heart pounding as she read the article. On the evening of February 14, 1945, the body of Evelyn Hart, a 26-year-old aspiring actress, was discovered in the Greenwich Village studio of Victor Blackwood, a reclusive artist known for his macabre works. Hart had been strangled, her body posed in a manner reminiscent of Blackwood's paintings. Blackwood was found nearby, having taken his own life. Among the items recovered was a Valentine's card, reportedly written by Blackwood, which contained a chilling message: "You will be mine forever." The card, described as ornate with a bleeding heart and thorny roses, was never found after the investigation closed. Locals have since whispered of a curse surrounding the card, claiming it brings misfortune to anyone who possesses it. Claire's breath caught in her throat. The description matched the card in her purse perfectly. She quickly printed the article, her hands trembling as she gathered her things. She needed to know more. Back at her apartment, Claire spread the printout on her coffee table, staring at the grainy photo of Victor Blackwood that accompanied the article. He was a handsome man, with sharp features and dark, brooding eyes, but there was something unsettling about his expression, a coldness that made her skin crawl. She dug deeper, searching for anything she could find about Blackwood and Evelyn Hart. She learned that Blackwood had been obsessed with Hart, painting her repeatedly in his studio, often in poses that were both beautiful and grotesque. Hart, it seemed, had tried to distance herself from him, but Blackwood's obsession only grew. On the night of her murder, witnesses reported hearing screams coming from his studio, but no one intervened. Claire's stomach turned as she read the details. She felt a strange connection to Evelyn, as though their lives were somehow intertwined. The whispers, the moving objects, the card, it all made sense now. Victor Blackwood's spirit was reaching out to her, just as he had reached out to Evelyn. But why her? What did he want? As the sun set, Claire sat on her couch, the card still in its plastic bag on the table in front of her. She felt a chill run down her spine, and for a moment, she thought she saw something move in the corner of the room, a shadow, darker than the rest, shifting unnaturally. She turned her head, but it was gone. The whispers started again, faint but insistent. "You are mine now." Claire clenched her fists, her fear giving way to anger. "No," she said aloud, her voice shaking but defiant. "I'm not yours. I won't be." But even as she said the words, she couldn't shake the feeling that Victor Blackwood was watching her, waiting for her to slip, to give in. And deep down, she knew this was only the beginning. The days that followed were a blur of fear and exhaustion. Claire's apartment, once her sanctuary, had become a prison. The whispers grew louder, more frequent, and the shadows seemed to move even when the lights were on. Miso refused to leave her side, his constant growling a reminder that whatever was happening wasn't just in her head. The card continued to reappear, no matter how many times Claire tried to get rid of it. She threw it in the trash, only to find it on her kitchen counter the next morning. She burned it in the fireplace, watching the flames consume the paper, but when she woke up, it was on her nightstand, pristine and untouched. The messages inside began to change, the words growing more menacing. "You cannot escape me. You are mine now. Forever." Claire's paranoia reached a breaking point. She stopped sleeping, too afraid to close her eyes, and when she did manage to doze off, her dreams were filled with visions of Victor Blackwood, his burning eyes, his cold smile, his hands reaching for her. She would wake up gasping, her sheets drenched in sweat, only to find the card lying beside her. Desperate for help, Claire reached out to Father O'Malley, a priest at a nearby church. She had never been particularly religious, but she was running out of options. The priest listened patiently as she recounted everything that had happened, his expression growing graver with each detail. "Cursed objects are not to be taken lightly," Father O'Malley said when she finished. "They carry with them a malevolent energy, a connection to the spirit world that can be difficult to sever. If what you're saying is true, this Victor Blackwood is using the card as a conduit to reach you. What can I do?" Claire asked, her voice breaking. "I can't live like this." Father O'Malley hesitated. "I can perform a blessing on your apartment, but I must warn you, if the spirit is as powerful as you say, it may not be enough. These entities feed on fear and despair. The more you resist, the stronger they become." Claire nodded, desperate for any kind of relief. That evening, Father O'Malley arrived at her apartment, carrying a vial of holy water and a worn Bible. He moved through each room, sprinkling the water and reciting prayers in a low, steady voice. Claire followed him, clutching a crucifix he had given her, her knuckles white. For a moment, it seemed to work. The air felt lighter, the whispers faded, and Claire dared to hope that it was over. But as soon as Father O'Malley left, the atmosphere shifted. The temperature in the apartment dropped sharply, her breath visible in the air, and the whispers returned, louder and more insistent than ever. "You cannot escape me." Claire backed into a corner, her eyes darting around the room. The shadows seemed to come alive, twisting and writhing like smoke. She saw him then, Victor Blackwood. His form was faint, almost translucent, but his eyes burned with an intensity that made her blood run cold. He stood in the corner of the room, his lips curled into a cruel smile. "Leave me alone!" Claire screamed, throwing the crucifix at him. It passed through his form and clattered to the floor, useless. Victor's laughter echoed through the room, low and mocking. "You are mine now," he said, his voice a chilling blend of whispers and growls. "Forever." Claire sank to the floor, tears streaming down her face. She felt trapped, helpless, as though the walls of her apartment were closing in around her. She couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't think. The only thing that kept her going was the faint hope that there was a way out, that she could break the curse before it consumed her completely. But as the days turned into weeks, that hope began to fade. The card continued to appear, the messages growing more threatening, and Victor's presence became more tangible. She could feel him watching her, his cold breath on her neck, his fingers brushing against her skin when she least expected it. One night, as she lay in bed, too exhausted to fight, she heard his voice again, softer this time, almost tender. "You will be mine forever." Claire closed her eyes, a single tear slipping down her cheek. She didn't know how much longer she could hold on. Claire sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the card in her hands. The ornate design, the bleeding heart, the thorny roses, it was all too familiar now, a symbol of the nightmare she couldn't escape. The whispers had become a constant hum in the back of her mind, and Victor's shadowy figure lingered in the corners of her vision, always watching, always waiting. She couldn't take it anymore. The fear, the exhaustion, the feeling of being hunted, it had all pushed her to the brink. She had to do something, even if it meant risking everything. Father O'Malley's blessing had failed, but maybe there was another way. Maybe she could destroy the card for good. Claire's hands trembled as she carried the card to the fireplace. She knelt on the hearth, her breath shallow, and struck a match. The flame flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. For a moment, she hesitated. What if this made things worse? What if it unleashed something even more dangerous? But she couldn't live like this anymore. She had to try. She dropped the card into the fire. At first, nothing happened. The flames licked at the edges of the paper, curling it black. Claire watched, her heart pounding, half expecting the card to resist, to remain untouched. But then, as the fire consumed it, the room began to change. The temperature plummeted, so cold that Claire could see her breath. The shadows around her twisted and writhed, stretching toward the ceiling like living things. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, until they became a deafening roar. Claire covered her ears, but the sound was inside her head, a cacophony of voices screaming in agony. And then, he appeared. Victor Blackwood materialized in front of the fireplace, his form solid and terrifyingly real. His eyes burned like embers, his face twisted in rage. The air around him seemed to crackle with energy, and Claire felt a pressure in her chest, as though the room itself were closing in on her. "You dare." Victor's voice was a thunderous growl, shaking the walls. "You think you can destroy me?" Claire scrambled backward, her back hitting the wall. She reached for the crucifix Father O'Malley had given her, clutching it like a lifeline. "Leave me alone," she screamed, her voice breaking. "I'm not yours. I'll never be yours." Victor's laughter was a low, menacing rumble. He stepped closer, his movements unnaturally smooth, like a predator stalking its prey. "You cannot escape me, Claire. You are mine. Forever." The room erupted into chaos. Furniture flew across the room, smashing against the walls. The windows rattled, and the lights flickered wildly before going out, plunging the apartment into darkness. Claire screamed as a chair slammed into the wall beside her, splintering into pieces. She could feel Victor's presence all around her, suffocating her, pulling her into the void. But then, through the terror, she remembered something Father O'Malley had said: these entities feed on fear. The more you resist, the stronger they become. Claire clenched her fists, forcing herself to stand. She was tired of being afraid. Tired of running. If Victor wanted her, he would have to fight for her. "No," she shouted, her voice shaking but defiant. "You don't own me. I'm not yours, and I never will be." Victor's form wavered, his expression flickering between rage and confusion. Claire took a step forward, holding the crucifix in front of her like a shield. "You're just a ghost," she said, her voice growing stronger. "A sad, pathetic ghost who couldn't let go. But I'm not Evelyn, and I'm not afraid of you anymore." The room seemed to hold its breath. Victor's form began to dissolve, his edges blurring like smoke. But then, with a roar, he lunged at her, his hands reaching for her throat. Claire reacted on instinct. She swung the crucifix, the metal striking Victor's form with a sound like a clap of thunder. He recoiled, his face contorted in pain, and for a moment, Claire thought she had won. But Victor wasn't finished. He surged forward again, his hands closing around her neck. Claire gasped, struggling to breathe, her vision darkening at the edges. She clawed at his hands, but they were like ice, unyielding and impossibly strong. In a final, desperate act, Claire reached for the fireplace poker, her fingers closing around the cold metal. With all her strength, she swung it at Victor's head. The poker passed through him, but the impact seemed to shatter his form. He let out a deafening scream, his body dissolving into smoke. The room fell silent, the shadows retreating, the whispers fading into nothing. Claire collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. The apartment was still, the only sound the crackling of the fire in the hearth. The card was gone, reduced to ashes. For the first time in weeks, Claire felt a glimmer of hope. It was over. Victor was gone. But as she sat there, her body trembling with exhaustion, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching her. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed darker than before, and the air felt heavy, oppressive. And then, faint but unmistakable, she heard it, a whisper, soft and cold, like a breath against her ear. Forever. Claire didn't stay in the apartment that night. She grabbed her coat, her purse, and miso, and fled into the cold, snowy streets of Greenwich Village. She didn't know where she was going, only that she couldn't be in that place any longer. The echoes of Victor's laughter still rang in her ears, and the weight of his presence lingered like a stain on her soul. She spent the night in a cheap motel on the outskirts of the city, the kind of place where the walls were thin and the lights flickered. She didn't sleep. Every creak, every rustle of the wind outside made her jump. Miso stayed close, his green eyes wide and alert, as if he too could sense that something wasn't right. The next morning, Claire called her landlord and told him she was moving out. She didn't explain why, how could she, but she didn't care about losing her security deposit or breaking the lease. All she cared about was getting as far away from that apartment as possible. She found a new place in Brooklyn, a small studio with bright windows and no history. She left most of her belongings behind, taking only what she could carry. The rest she donated or threw away. She didn't want any reminders of what had happened. For a while, life seemed almost normal. Claire threw herself into her work, designing logos and posters for clients who had no idea what she'd been through. She reconnected with Sarah, who had been worried sick about her, and even went on a few dates, though she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. But the nightmares didn't stop. Every night, she dreamed of Victor, his burning eyes, his cold smile, his hands reaching for her. She would wake up gasping, her sheets drenched in sweat, and for a moment, she would swear she saw him standing in the corner of the room. And then, one morning, it happened. Claire was making coffee in her new kitchen, the sunlight streaming through the windows, when she heard the mail slot click. She froze, her heart pounding, as an envelope slid onto the floor. It was ornate, with gold filigree and a bleeding heart surrounded by thorny roses. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. The message inside was written in deep crimson ink, the letters slightly smudged, as though the writer had pressed too hard. Forever isn't over. Claire dropped the card, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She backed away, her eyes darting around the room, and that's when she saw him. Victor's shadowy figure stood in the corner, his burning eyes fixed on her, his lips curled into a cruel smile. "You are mine," he whispered, his voice echoing through the room. "Forever." Claire screamed, but no one came to help. The sunlight faded, the room growing darker and colder, and she realized with a sinking dread that she would never be free. Victor's curse had followed her, and it would never let her go. The young couple laughed as they walked through the park, their hands intertwined. It was Valentine's Day, and the city was alive with the kind of romantic energy that made everything feel magical. Snowflakes drifted lazily through the air, and the couple paused to take a selfie in front of a snow-covered bench. When they got home, they found an envelope waiting for them in their mailbox. It was ornate, with gold filigree and a bleeding heart surrounded by thorny roses. The woman picked it up, her eyes lighting up with curiosity. "What's this?" she asked, holding it up for her boyfriend to see. "Must be a Valentine's card," he said, grinning. "Open it." She did, her smile fading as she read the message inside. The words were written in deep crimson ink, the letters slightly smudged, as though the writer had pressed too hard. "You will be mine forever." The couple laughed, dismissing it as a prank or a strange gift from a secret admirer. They set the card on their mantel, unaware of the shadowy figure watching them from the corner of the room. The camera panned to the card, its bleeding heart glistening in the dim light, and then faded to black as the whispers began. "Forever." Thank you so much for watching. If this story sent chills down your spine or made you believe in the unseen, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and share it with your friends. Let us know in the comments, do you believe in spirits, or do you think there's a logical explanation for these hauntings? Make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss out on our next spine-tingling story. Until next time, stay curious, stay brave, and remember, sometimes, the past never truly stays buried. Thanks for being part of our journey. See you in the next video.